In a quiet village tucked between rolling hills and dense forests, life moved with a rhythm both ancient and unforgiving. The villagers went about their days tending to their fields, caring for their livestock, and gathering by the river to share stories that had been passed down through generations. Yet amid this simple, serene existence, there was a tension that lingered in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. It was here in this village that a young woman lived, known to all as Amina. She was unlike anyone the village had seen in decades, her mind sharp and her spirit unyielding, carrying a bravery that seemed almost impossible in a place where conformity and obedience were prized above all else. From a young age, Amina had shown an uncanny cleverness, able to solve disputes with words where others resorted to anger, and able to find solutions to problems that had confounded even the wisest of elders. Her eyes, deep and observant, seemed to see not just the world around her but the intentions of those who walked within it, and her hands, though delicate, were always steady, ready to act when the moment demanded courage over caution. Villagers both admired and feared her, whispering tales of her exploits in hushed tones whenever she passed by, marveling at her intelligence while secretly wondering if such boldness could ever bring her trouble. It was this very boldness, the courage that made her shine like a lone flame in the dark, that would soon attract the envy and malice of those who prided themselves on control and tradition. The elders, men and women who had ruled the village with unquestioned authority for decades, began to regard her cleverness not as a blessing but as a threat. Their admiration twisted into suspicion, and their respect curdled into quiet schemes whispered behind closed doors. They did not yet act openly, but the first seeds of danger were being sown, invisible to most, yet sensed by Amina in subtle ways, a shadow that lingered too long, a whisper that carried a tone of warning, the faint chill of eyes upon her back when none should have been watching. Even in her moments of daily chores as she swept the compound or fetched water from the river, a sense of unease clung to her, though she could not yet place its source. There was a story, passed from mother to daughter, that spoke of darkness that could not be seen but always found its mark, and in quiet moments, Amina wondered if that story had chosen her as its next chapter. Despite the growing tension, she moved through the village with the same poise and confidence that had always defined her, refusing to let fear dictate her steps or dampen the spark in her eyes. Her presence was magnetic, drawing both admiration and hidden resentment in equal measure, and it was this mix of awe and envy that set the stage for the trials that would come. The villagers continued their routines, unaware of the storm brewing quietly at the edges of their everyday life, while Amina herself could feel the undercurrents of danger brushing against her like the first whispers of a coming gale. And so, with courage woven into every step she took and a mind ever alert to the intentions of those around her, Amina walked into the days ahead, unaware that her strength would soon be tested in ways no one could have anticipated. The story that was about to unfold would reveal not just the cruelty that humans were capable of, but also the unexpected forms of justice that could rise from even the most impossible circumstances. By the end of this tale, what seemed like helplessness would turn into power, and what was taken from her in cruelty would become the very means by which the wrongdoers would meet the justice they had long feared. The elders of the village were a group whose presence was felt long before their footsteps echoed across the clay paths, a council of men and women whose authority had been built over decades of tradition, fear, and careful manipulation. They prided themselves on maintaining order, on ensuring that the old ways were respected and that any deviation from their prescribed norms was swiftly corrected. Their faces, lined with age and the weight of countless decisions, often carried expressions of sternness, but beneath the surface lurked a complexity that few could see: envy, suspicion, and a deep-seated fear of anyone who challenged their unspoken monopoly on wisdom and power. It was not just that the young woman, Amina, had a clever mind, it was the way she carried it, openly questioning petty rules, speaking her mind with confidence, and solving disputes with insight that left even the most learned elders uncertain. In her presence, the elders felt exposed, as if their years of accumulated authority were suddenly fragile, vulnerable to scrutiny they could not withstand. They whispered among themselves, their conversations laced with veiled warnings, their eyes flicking toward her as if she were a living mirror reflecting their own insecurities. At first, the tension was subtle, manifesting in small gestures rather than open hostility. A slight pause in conversation when she entered the council circle, a careful choice of words when she spoke, and a quiet, almost imperceptible frown whenever her cleverness brought a solution they could not claim as their own. The elders began to view her intellect not as a gift to the village, but as a challenge to their supremacy, a threat to the carefully constructed hierarchy that had governed their lives for generations. They spoke in parables during council meetings, crafting stories that hinted at consequences for those who dared to overstep, and even arranged for tasks and errands that seemed mundane but were intended to test her resolve and gauge her reactions. To an untrained eye, these actions might have appeared as simple village management, but to Amina, every glance, every muttered comment carried an edge of menace, a warning that her brilliance was being watched with eyes sharpened by envy and fear. Despite their outward composure, the elders could not hide the storm brewing beneath their measured facades. Some nights, they gathered in private, away from prying ears, plotting subtle ways to curb her influence. One elder, his voice barely above a whisper, spoke of limiting her interactions with the villagers, suggesting that her cleverness could sway the people and disrupt the balance of power. Another proposed more secretive measures, hinting at ways to remind her of the boundaries imposed by tradition without openly harming her, a psychological tightening of the noose, as it were. And yet, even as they schemed, there was a flicker of unease, a recognition that the young woman was no ordinary girl to be controlled through fear alone. She was perceptive, resilient, and possessed a strength that even the most cunning of elders could not fully anticipate. As days passed, the air in the village seemed to change subtly, almost imperceptibly. The birdsong carried a different cadence, the wind whispered through the trees with a sharpness that had not been there before, and Amina herself began to feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The elders' envy and fear were not hidden. They moved like shadows behind every smile, every polite word, and the village itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when tension would erupt into action. In those moments, it became clear that the young woman's cleverness was no longer just a gift. It was a beacon that drew the envy of those who had grown accustomed to unquestioned power, and the first threads of a dangerous plot were beginning to weave themselves into the fabric of the village's seemingly peaceful life. Even before the elders' envy and fear took concrete form, Amina began to feel the stirrings of danger, subtle at first, like the faint tremor of a leaf before a storm breaks. She noticed it in the way the wind shifted along the village paths, carrying whispers that were almost voices, phrases that seemed to brush against her ears though no one was near. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, she would wake from dreams that left her heart pounding, visions of shadowed figures moving through the village, their faces obscured yet their intentions unmistakably dark. In these dreams, she often saw herself restrained, powerless, her hands bound while invisible forces loomed around her, wielding knives and tools of harm. Though fleeting, these visions carried a weight of certainty, as if the world itself were warning her of a threat that could not be ignored. She began to take note of every small anomaly, a sudden hush among villagers when she approached, glances that lingered too long, the way certain elders would straighten themselves in her presence, their eyes flicking away at the last moment. Each detail, she realized, was a thread in a pattern that painted a picture of hostility, a tapestry woven from envy, fear, and dark intention. Amina's foresight compelled her to act with caution, yet she moved carefully, never allowing the shadow of fear to make her timid. She learned to read the subtle language of the village, observing the cadence of conversations, the pauses between words, the almost imperceptible gestures that betrayed hidden plots. When a neighbor, normally warm and talkative, offered her a gift with an unnatural smile, she felt the prickling sense of unease that told her to decline politely. She became adept at walking the line between alertness and normalcy, ensuring that her awareness did not draw suspicion while also giving her the time to anticipate moves before they were made. At night, she would sit by the window of her small home, listening to the rustle of the wind through the trees, watching the flicker of torchlight from the elders' compound, piecing together intentions from patterns only she seemed to notice. Her dreams became both warning and guide, teaching her which paths to avoid, which conversations to engage in cautiously, and which areas of the village were safe only in daylight. It was as if the unseen forces around her, omens, shadows, whispers, were forming a map of the danger ahead, and she, guided by intelligence and instinct, was learning to navigate it with the precision of someone who understood that survival depended on subtlety as much as courage. Despite her growing awareness, Amina did not confront the elders openly. She understood that drawing attention to her foresight could provoke the very danger she sought to avoid. Instead, she relied on small, clever maneuvers, altering her daily routes to avoid being alone near certain compounds, feigning interest in harmless tasks to mask her awareness, and listening carefully to conversations in which the elders attempted to gauge her reactions. Each observation strengthened her understanding of their fears and intentions, revealing cracks in the walls of their authority that might one day be used to her advantage. The villagers, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface, continued their routines, leaving Amina to walk among them with a quiet vigilance. She smiled when spoken to, assisted the elderly with chores, and maintained an outward calm that belied the storm she sensed approaching, her mind always turning over possibilities and strategies. Some nights, the omens became more vivid. A sudden crow perched on her windowsill, its black eyes glinting in the moonlight, letting out a caw that seemed like a warning rather than a sound of nature. Streams in the village appeared muddied for no reason, carrying leaves and odd patterns that reminded her of the shadows she had seen in dreams. Even the stars seemed to shift, forming unfamiliar constellations that whispered caution into her imagination. Amina knew these signs could be dismissed by the unobservant, but she had learned to trust them, understanding that her survival, and the eventual course of justice, might depend on noticing what others ignored. Each omen, each subtle warning sharpened her foresight, honing her instincts as both shield and sword in the unseen battles to come. Through these careful observations, Amina walked the village with an almost supernatural awareness, a mind alert to invisible threats and a heart steady despite the growing weight of fear. She avoided confrontation not out of weakness, but out of wisdom, knowing that patience, vigilance, and cunning would be her greatest allies in the trials that awaited her. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow became a teacher, and she prepared herself quietly for the moment when the envious elders would make their move. The village seemed ordinary to the untrained eye, but to Amina, it had transformed into a chessboard, and she was already thinking several steps ahead, ready to meet cruelty with foresight, cunning, and a courage that no physical harm could ever diminish. The elders, their envy and fear now fully hardened into determination, began to weave a plan designed to ensnare Amina. They spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors, voices heavy with secrecy, plotting not out of justice but out of a desire to reclaim the control they felt slipping through their fingers. Their words were deliberate, each suggestion building toward a single dark purpose: to humiliate her, weaken her, and remind the village that no one could challenge the established order without consequence. They disguised their intentions under the veneer of concern, crafting invitations that seemed kind, even honorable. One elder suggested a celebration of her cleverness, a gathering to recognize her contributions to the village, while another spoke of a special task where she could assist in organizing a community project. All these schemes were coated in flattery and respect, carefully designed so that Amina would not suspect the trap being laid before her. Amina, perceptive as ever, noticed the subtle shift in the elders' demeanor, the slight tension behind their smiles, the faint glimmer of calculation in their eyes. Yet, the lure was strong. Her sense of duty to the village and her desire to maintain harmony made the invitation difficult to refuse. She approached the arranged meeting with caution, observing every detail: the placement of torches, the positioning of villagers, the careful alignment of the elders' expressions. Everything felt too precise, too deliberate. Even as she stepped forward, a part of her mind sounded alarms, whispering that danger was near, yet the promise of celebration and communal respect masked the threat. Little did she know, the trap was already set, shadows stretching around her like silent sentinels, ready to strike the moment she let down her guard. The web of deceit tightened, and the first act of cruelty was poised to unfold, shattering the calm of the village and marking the beginning of a trial that would test not just her strength, but the very essence of her courage. The moment arrived with a cruel precision that made the air itself feel heavy, as if the village had been holding its breath in silent anticipation. Amina, lured by the elders' carefully constructed ruse, found herself isolated in the compound, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. Their smiles had long since vanished, replaced by expressions of cold calculation, and the whispers of flattery turned into the hiss of threat. She realized too late that the celebration was nothing more than a guise, a stage upon which her suffering would be displayed. Panic surged through her veins, but her mind, sharp and unyielding, refused to surrender to terror entirely. She tried to step back, tried to plead, but the space around her had been arranged to prevent escape. The elders advanced, hands steady, eyes devoid of empathy, wielding knives that glinted ominously in the fading light. Every heartbeat pounded like a drum in her ears, each breath heavy with the metallic taste of fear, yet beneath the surface, a spark of determination remained, a whisper of defiance that refused to be extinguished. When the first strike came, pain exploded through her hands, searing and immediate, a sensation so raw that it stole her breath and made the world tilt violently. She cried out, a sound that pierced the otherwise hushed compound, echoing against the walls and startling those who had come merely to watch. Villagers who had gathered at a distance gasped in horror, their faces pale with disbelief, unable to comprehend the depths of cruelty being enacted before them. Some covered their mouths, others turned away, but none could deny the truth of the act. The elders, maintaining their facade of control, continued without hesitation, each movement deliberate, as if they were cutting away not just flesh but the very spirit that had dared challenge them. Yet even in the midst of agony, Amina's mind remained alert, noting every angle, every weakness, every hesitation in her assailant's motions. Though her body screamed with pain, her awareness never faltered. In that moment of excruciating suffering, something extraordinary began to stir. A faint, shadowy figure mirrored her every thought, a silent companion that seemed to draw strength from her fear and transform it into something potent and alive. The villagers could not see it, but the subtle shift in the air, the way the light bent strangely, the way the shadows seemed to twitch independently, hinted at a force beyond mere flesh and bone. Pain had not broken her, it had awakened something else, something that could not be harmed by knives or fear. As she collapsed to the ground, trembling yet resolute, the elders failed to notice the first flicker of retribution forming in the spaces where light and shadow intertwined. The act, brutal as it was, did not mark the end of Amina's power. It marked the beginning of a force that would rise from her suffering, silent, invisible and inexorably determined. In that harrowing moment, while the village reeled from shock and the elders reveled in their cruelty, a single truth became clear. The young woman they sought to destroy was not powerless, and the shadows that now clung to her would soon deliver justice in ways they could never anticipate. After the brutal act, Amina was left alone, her body broken and her hands gone, the cold stone beneath her pressing against her bruised limbs as if the earth itself mourned her suffering. The elders, confident that their cruelty had extinguished her spirit, returned to their halls, leaving her in the shadows where the light barely reached. Pain lanced through her body with every shallow breath, yet even in the depths of agony, her mind refused to succumb. As the village continued its routines unaware of the silent struggle occurring just beyond their eyes, Amina's thoughts drifted to her family, to the lessons learned at her mother's knee, to the stories whispered by her father in the quiet hours of night. She remembered the cleverness that had always set her apart, the sharpness of her mind that had allowed her to navigate challenges that others thought insurmountable. Each memory became a lifeline, a reminder that while her body had been violated, her intelligence, her spirit, and her cunning remained untouched, waiting to be wielded in ways the elders could not yet imagine. In the eerie stillness, she felt something else, a subtle presence that had always lingered at the edge of her perception but had never fully revealed itself. Her shadow, once an ordinary reflection of her form, now pulsed with an almost sentient awareness, stretching and curling in the dim light with a life of its own. It seemed to mirror not just her body but her thoughts, her anger, and her grief, bending and shifting as if it understood the injustice inflicted upon her. Amina, though weakened, recognized this as a mysterious force tied intimately to her being, a silent companion that had absorbed the intensity of her pain and now waited, patient and calculating, for the moment when it could act. She marveled at the shadow's subtle movements, feeling a mixture of fear and hope, realizing that it represented something beyond mere magic. It was a manifestation of her will, her defiance, and her unbroken resolve. As night deepened, she allowed herself to reflect on the chain of events that had led to her isolation, analyzing the elders' cunning and predicting their next moves. She understood that her survival depended not only on healing but on planning, on using both her mind and the shadow that had awakened alongside her pain. The quiet moments became her teachers, shaping her thoughts into strategies and her grief into resolve. She was alone, yes, but she was not helpless. In the stillness of that darkened space, Amina realized that what had been taken from her, the hand she once used to create, protect and wield, was not the end of her power. Her shadow, mysterious and alive, had emerged as an extension of her cunning nature, a harbinger of justice that would one day strike back against those who had dared to inflict cruelty upon her. As the first light of dawn struggled to pierce the gloom, Amina remained still, her body weary and battered, yet her mind alert with a strange, electrifying awareness. It began subtly at first, a flicker along the edge of her vision, a shadow that moved with a rhythm independent of her own, bending and twisting as if it possessed a consciousness separate from her own. At first, she thought it a trick of the dim light, a manifestation of exhaustion and pain, but the shadow's movements soon grew deliberate, matching not the motions of her body, but the currents of her thoughts. When anger surged through her chest, the shadow recoiled and then stretched, coiling like a serpent poised to strike. When sorrow threatened to overwhelm her, it leaned closer, a silent companion that absorbed her grief and transformed it into a quiet, simmering strength. Amina realized with both awe and a hint of fear that this was no ordinary reflection. It had become sentient, alive in a way that mirrored her emotions, her desires, and most importantly, her need for vengeance. She tested its presence carefully, focusing on her rage, imagining the elders who had inflicted pain upon her, the knives that had severed her hands, and the faces of those who had thought themselves untouchable. The shadow responded instantly, stretching outward, dark tendrils flicking like the blades of a hidden weapon, writhing with a tension that seemed to promise justice in silence. It was attuned to her mind in a way that felt uncanny, moving as if it could anticipate her thoughts, ready to act in the precise moment she willed it. Amina marveled at this strange connection, sensing that the shadow was not just a reflection of her anger, but an extension of her will, a partner in a revenge that could not be restrained by mortal limitations. In the solitude of her hiding place, she allowed her imagination to guide the shadow, picturing scenarios in which the elders would feel the consequences of their cruelty. The shadow writhed and expanded in response, as if tasting the possibilities, analyzing weakness, and preparing for strikes that no ordinary hand could deliver. Amina's mind, sharpened by pain and guided by cunning, worked in tandem with this mysterious force, plotting with a precision born of both intellect and supernatural aid. Though she had been physically maimed, she felt a surge of power that no blade could sever, a force that whispered a promise. What had been taken from her could now return in a form far beyond the expectations of those who had wronged her. By the time the village awoke to the ordinary sounds of life, the clatter of pots, the low murmur of early conversations, the shadow had fully awakened, poised and patient, stretching along walls, floors and corners, invisible yet palpably alive. It mirrored her thoughts, her fury, her grief, and her determination, a dark sentinel ready to move at her command. Amina understood with clarity that the game had changed. She was no longer simply a victim, she had become a strategist, a force intertwined with something beyond flesh and bone. Her shadow had awoken, and with it, the first stirrings of justice that would soon ripple through the village, unseen but inevitable, heralding a reckoning that none could escape. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The elders, confident that Amina was broken and powerless, continued their routines, unaware that the unseen force lingering in her shadow had begun to stir. At first, the strikes were subtle, a misplaced knife in the kitchen that cut an elder's hand instead of the intended food, a lantern toppling without cause and sending flames skittering dangerously across the floor, a chair collapsing under a heavy man who had mocked her cleverness weeks before. Each incident was fleeting, almost dismissible as accident or misfortune, yet a growing sense of dread began to settle among the conspirators. Their eyes flickered nervously at corners and shadows, and their steps became hesitant, as if invisible eyes followed every movement. The shadow moved with silent precision, striking only where it would be felt most, feeding off the anger and sorrow it mirrored from Amina's mind. It did not seek to destroy outright, but to instill fear, to remind those who had caused her pain that control could slip as easily as it was grasped. Elders began whispering among themselves, their voices tinged with paranoia, recounting incidents that seemed impossible, unable to explain the sudden cascade of injuries and accidents that defied logic. A hammer fell, a ladder swayed when no wind blew, and a jar of herbs tumbled to the ground, slicing through skin like a blade guided by an unseen hand. With each subtle strike, the shadow's power became more tangible, an almost living extension of Amina's mind, moving with intent and patience. The elders' confidence wavered, replaced by fear and suspicion, and though they could not see the force that now haunted them, they felt its presence in every unexplained sound, in every sudden movement of objects, in the flicker of shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. The first taste of vengeance had begun, quiet but undeniable, and the balance of power in the village had started to shift. The village, once a place of ordinary routines and quiet harmony, began to feel different, as though the air itself had grown heavier, charged with an invisible tension that made even the birdsong seem cautious and deliberate. The elders, once unchallenged in their authority, found themselves besieged not by armies or open rebellion, but by a creeping, inexplicable fear that gnawed at their confidence. Every morning brought new surprises. A window smashed without wind, a stack of carefully stored firewood toppled in a perfect cascade, marks and scratches appearing on walls as if clawed by invisible hands. At first, they tried to dismiss these events as coincidences, accidents, or the natural wear of the village itself, but as the frequency and precision of these incidents increased, doubt began to seed itself in their minds. Whispers of paranoia circulated among them, a growing recognition that the young woman they had thought broken was not only alive but connected to a power they could not comprehend, let alone control. Their conversations became guarded, their once bold decisions tentative, and a cloud of suspicion hung over their every interaction. Each elder looked at the others with mistrust, questioning whether someone among them was secretly conspiring with forces beyond human understanding. Yet there was no traitor, no collusion, only the silent vengeance of a shadow that moved with intent, guided by Amina's thoughts and emotions. It struck subtly, unpredictably, leaving evidence that teased the mind but defied explanation. A candle would flare and scorch an elder's sleeve, a chair would collapse just as a foot touched it, a sharp sound like a blade slicing the air would echo through the hall when no one held a weapon. Fear took root, spreading like wildfire through their ranks, and the elder's once commanding presence began to crumble under the weight of the unseen, intangible threat. The villagers too began to sense the shift in the air. Ordinary tasks took on a cautionary rhythm. People paused when shadows lengthened in unusual ways, and whispered stories circulated about the young woman and her shadow. Some claimed to have glimpsed her form moving where it should not have been, stretching impossibly long in the moonlight or appearing to merge with walls, floors, and objects before dissolving into darkness. Others spoke of dreams in which her eyes burned with an intensity that demanded attention, as if calling for acknowledgement of her resilience and power. Though no one could fully explain the phenomenon, it became a quiet truth in the village. Amina was no longer merely a girl. They felt her presence in every corner, her unseen force a reminder of her cunning and the injustice inflicted upon her. The elders, their paranoia now intertwined with desperation, attempted to regain control through meetings and edicts, commanding order as they once had. But their voices trembled with unease, and their decrees were met with subtle resistance, the villagers now alert to the power of the unseen. Fear transformed into superstition, superstition into whispered reverence, and the legend of Amina's shadow began to take root, spreading like a slow, deliberate tide. Even as the elders sought to suppress it, their authority weakened under the persistent, enigmatic influence of a force they could not comprehend. The village, caught between ordinary life and supernatural vigilance, shifted imperceptibly, with every step of its people guided by shadows, whispers, and a profound understanding that justice, long delayed, had found a new form. In the growing darkness of their paranoia, the elders realized a truth that chilled them more than any physical threat. The shadow was beyond their control. No threats, no traps, no intimidation could touch it, and every attempt to fight it only seemed to strengthen its presence. The invisible force, born from cruelty and sustained by Amina's intelligence and resilience, had become an extension of her will, an unstoppable echo of vengeance. The village, once confident in the predictability of life, now trembled in awe and fear, whispering the unspoken truth that the young woman's power had transcended flesh, and that her shadow was no longer simply a reflection. It was a herald of reckoning, patient, precise, and inevitable. The elders, desperate to reclaim the control they had lost, gathered under the cover of night, their faces lined with fear and determination, hands trembling as they gripped knives, clubs, and charms meant to ward off the unknown. They had tried reasoning, intimidation, and subtle strikes, but the shadow had proven untouchable, bending the laws of the ordinary world with silent, precise vengeance. Now they resolved to confront it openly, to destroy the young woman and the dark force that had risen from her suffering. Amina, hidden in the shadows, watched quietly, her senses heightened, aware of every step, every whispered plan, every shiver of fear that betrayed their certainty that they could still control fate. The air seemed charged with electricity, the wind carrying a tension that made torches flicker and shadows stretch unnaturally, as if the night itself was aware of the impending clash. When the elders entered the clearing where she had been lured, the shadow moved first, slipping along walls and trees, striking without sound, without warning. Objects levitated or toppled, spears twisted and fell, fires leapt unnaturally, and the very earth seemed to respond to her will. The elders shouted incantations, swung their weapons and called upon the gods and spirits, but their efforts were futile. The shadow anticipated every move, turning their aggression back upon them with a calm, unrelenting precision that chilled their hearts. Each attack seemed almost cinematic in its precision. A knife spun from one elder's hand to pin another's sleeve, a torch flared and singed a cloak, and a bundle of stones rolled silently to trip those who moved too boldly. In that tense confrontation, greed, fear, and cruelty collided with supernatural justice. The elders realized too late that their attempts to dominate and harm had only awakened a force beyond comprehension, one that mirrored every ounce of anger, cunning, and resilience within Amina. Human ambition faltered in the face of the intangible, and for the first time, the elders felt the true weight of the young woman's power, and the reckoning that would not be denied. The night air grew thick with tension as the shadow, fully awakened and sentient, moved with deliberate grace, flowing over walls, across courtyards, and around the elders like liquid darkness. Every flicker, every subtle motion carried purpose, echoing the precision of Amina's mind and the intensity of her anger. The elders, now pale and trembling, could feel the weight of their past cruelty pressing down on them as the shadow twisted and coiled, striking with a silence that belied its power. One by one the instruments of their authority, clubs, knives, charms, were rendered useless, either toppled, twisted, or shattered, leaving them exposed to the consequences of their own malice. Yet the shadow's retribution was not mindless. It was poetic, calculated, and perfectly matched to the sins they had committed. A strike here toppled the arrogance of one who had mocked her cleverness, a sudden flare of light revealed the fear long hidden in another's eyes, and a subtle, unseen force caused the most deceitful of the elders to stumble in a manner that left them humbled before the village they had tried to control. The villagers, who had long whispered tales of her cleverness and strength, now witnessed the impossible, their awe mixed with relief and a deep, stirring sense of justice. They saw the elders, once symbols of unchecked power, brought low not by brute force, but by a force that reflected the balance of fairness and consequence. Shadows twisted into shapes that mirrored the elders' cruelty, illustrating each misdeed and then releasing it, as if the universe itself had demanded recompense. In the aftermath, silence descended, heavy but cleansing. The shadow retreated, leaving the village bathed in soft dawn light, the threat gone but the lesson imprinted forever. Amina, though scarred and changed, stood as a testament to courage, intelligence, and resilience. The elders had learned that cruelty carries its own price, and the village felt the restoration of balance in every whispered story, every cautious glance, and every renewed smile. Justice had returned, measured, elegant, and eternal, a reminder that even when darkness seems to prevail, wisdom and courage, joined with forces beyond the ordinary, can restore harmony and protect the innocent. When dawn finally broke, it came not as a gentle promise of warmth but as a hesitant light that crawled across the village like a question, unsure of what had just occurred in the night. The smoke from burnt torches drifted lazily in the early air, mingling with the scent of rain-soaked earth and fear. No one spoke at first. The villagers emerged cautiously from their homes, their eyes wide, scanning the paths and courtyards for signs of what remained. The elders' compound, once the proud heart of authority, lay in eerie stillness. No chants, no commands, just silence, deep and deliberate. The few who survived stood trembling, their power shattered, their pride hollowed out like old wood. Amina stood apart from them, her form thin but unbroken, her eyes reflecting a calm beyond pain. Where her hands had once been, the bandages were clean, the wounds closed, not through the mercy of any healer, but through something older and unseen. Her shadow, faint but still alive beneath the morning sun, stretched across the ground beside her. And when she moved, it followed, no longer wild, no longer vengeful, but bound to her will like a guardian that understood peace. The people gathered, hesitant but drawn to her presence. 4 months they had whispered of her cleverness, her misfortune, her quiet strength, but now, standing before her, they saw something greater, an embodiment of balance, of divine justice carried not by swords or bloodlines, but by courage and intellect. Children peered from behind their mother's legs, eyes wide with both fear and admiration. The elders, stripped of their pride, bowed their heads low, their voices shaking as they murmured apologies that came too late. Amina did not speak to them. She did not need to. The silence between them spoke all that needed to be said. The cruelty that had cut her hands had failed to cut her spirit, and in that failure they had lost their power forever. As days passed, the village began to heal. Fields that had gone untended began to grow again, water ran clearer in the streams, and the heavy air of fear slowly lifted. Yet the story of what happened was never forgotten. It was retold in whispers, in songs, and in the pauses between laughter. The people spoke not only of her suffering but of her triumph, the way she had turned pain into strength and injustice into legend. Children were told never to mock the powerless, for power can take many forms. And elders warned each other that cruelty, once born, always finds its way home. Amina herself lived quietly. She no longer sought revenge, for the shadow had already delivered it in full. Instead, she spent her days teaching, guiding the young, advising the uncertain, and reminding them that wisdom was the greatest weapon any soul could wield. When people asked how she continued on without her hands, she smiled faintly and said, "You do not need hands to build something lasting. You only need courage and the will to rise again." Her words spread through the region, becoming a proverb repeated by travelers and elders alike. And yet, there was always something mysterious about her presence. At twilight, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the earth, those who passed her hut swore they saw her shadow move before she did, an elegant, quiet movement that seemed alive, almost protective. Some said it was a trick of the light, others claimed it was her spirit's reflection, still restless, ensuring the balance she had restored would never again be broken. Years later, when Amina's time finally came and she was buried beneath the great baobab tree, the villagers wept, not just for her life, but for the story she had become. That night, the moon shone brighter than anyone had seen before, and her shadow, though her body was gone, appeared faintly on the trunk of the baobab as if carved in darkness. Children saw it first and ran to tell their parents. By dawn, the entire village stood before it, silent, reverent, and fearful in the most respectful way. They understood that the shadow was not just hers anymore. It belonged to all who had ever been wronged, silenced, or underestimated. It was a symbol of endurance and defiance, a whisper of strength that could never be cut away. Generations passed and her name became legend. Travelers came from distant lands to see the Tree of Shadows, where her spirit was said to rest. People left offerings of light, candles, small mirrors, and carved stones, to honor the woman whose courage had changed the fate of her people. The story grew with each telling, shifting slightly but always carrying the same heart, that cruelty can wound the body but never the spirit, and that courage, once awakened, walks even where flesh cannot follow. Among the villagers, her tale became a moral compass. Parents taught their children that wisdom without compassion leads to ruin, that fear of the clever and the brave is the seed of downfall, and that no act of cruelty escapes the balance of justice. The elders who once ruled with arrogance were replaced by those who listened, learned, and governed with humility. And the village prospered, not through fear, but through respect for the unseen forces that hold truth steady against lies and injustice. Still, on certain nights, when the moon hung high and silver light spilled across the land, some swore they saw her walking again, a shadow gliding beside the wind, her steps soundless, her presence calm but watchful. Dogs would lift their heads and fall silent, as if recognizing an old protector passing by. The wind would stir, carrying whispers that felt like a lullaby and a warning all at once. Do not raise your hand against the innocent, the air seemed to murmur, for even a shadow remembers. The moral of Amina's story was clear, timeless, and sharp as the blade that once betrayed her. Cruelty cannot silence courage, and justice, no matter how long it sleeps, always finds a way to wake. The villagers learned that power born from fear will always crumble, but power born from integrity and truth endures beyond the flesh, beyond death, beyond the light itself. Amina's shadow became a living symbol of this truth, a reminder that those who walk in darkness with courage in their hearts will always carry their own light. In the years that followed, the story spread across regions and generations. In every telling, her image remained the same. A young woman standing tall even when broken, her missing hands a testament not to loss, but to transformation. Her courage became a lesson not only for the oppressed but also for the oppressors, a reminder that no cruelty can go unanswered, and no injustice can erase the will of one who refuses to bow. Her life became a prayer, her shadow a prophecy. And so, the legend ends as it began, with a woman and her shadow. Not as a symbol of darkness, but of resilience and redemption. For long after her body returned to the earth, the shadow remained loyal and alive, etched forever in the memory of her people. When storms gathered, when injustice stirred, or when someone in the village faced despair, they looked toward the old baobab and whispered her name, believing her spirit still listened. Some say if you look closely at the ground beneath the tree during a full moon, you can still see her shadow rise for just a moment, graceful and calm, holding a knife made of light, not to harm, but to remind the world that even in darkness, courage takes form. And thus her story lingers, whispered in every wind and echoed in every silence. Even without hands, she carved her own justice, and her shadow still walks to protect the